The year is 634 AD, and the ancient world is bleeding. For 30 years of torment, the two giants that dominated late antiquity, the Christian Byzantine Empire and the Zoroastrian Sassanid state of Persia, had locked horns in a conflict so horrific and all-consuming that neither realized they were destroying the very ground upon which they stood. Whole provinces had been harvested twice, once for grain and once for corpses. Look at Emperor Heraclius. Just 4 years earlier, he had entered Jerusalem barefoot, tears streaming down his face, to restore the true cross to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, hailed as the greatest savior of Christendom. Yet look at him now, an old man, ravaged by illness, trembling inside his silken tent near Homs as he listens to the reports of his panic-stricken commanders. His hands, the same hands that once bore the relic through Jerusalem's gates, shake now not with piety, but with fever and dread. The imperial treasury lay empty, and the legions had gone unpaid for months. Deserters were being hanged along the roadside as a warning to the rest, their bodies left to rot as grim milestones for retreating columns. The borderlands had become desolate wastelands inhabited by grief-stricken peasants who viewed tax collectors as bloodsuckers and who now eyed the southern horizon with a new and unfamiliar fear. Heraclius had believed his enemies vanquished and that peace had finally settled upon the world. He had not the slightest inkling that an unstoppable fire had ignited far to the south, amid the scorching heat of the Arabian desert. It is a force born not of the ambition of an imperial dynasty, but of an absolute, indisputable divine mission, led at its vanguard by a man who knows no defeat and shows no mercy to those who stand and fight him. The mere mention of his name struck terror that froze the blood in the veins of military commanders from Basra to Damascus. Khalid ibn al-Walid, the Sword of God. Khalid did not wage war merely to seize territory, but to shatter the will of any force daring to stand against him. He was a master of total war, a commander whose mind operated like a ruthless game of chess played at breakneck speed. He devised punishments for those who defied his authority that would remain forever seared into memory. Months earlier, while his armies were bogged down in the battles of Iraq, he had received a single order from the Caliph: march to the Levant and assume command. What Khalid did next defied all logic. He led his light cavalry across the arid desert, a vast, trackless wilderness no army had ever dared to enter. He forced his men to water their camels until fully sated, then slaughter them mid-march and slit open their bellies to drink the stored water, liquid that had already spoiled and mingled with bile. As for the men who collapsed from the ravages of thirst, they were simply left where they fell. There was no time to spare, and Khalid had made his resolve clear. There would be no turning back. When he suddenly appeared, like a phantom emerging from the thick desert haze behind Byzantine lines, the imperial garrisons believed that desert demons had taken human form. Khalid would not deign to negotiate with those who resisted him. Byzantine soldiers captured, while still armed, were executed in full view of their fellow townsmen, and their heads were hoisted onto spear tips along the roadside as a warning to the next garrison. Villages that barred their gates against the advancing force found those gates burned and torn from their hinges by nightfall. In the wake of the marching legions lay scorched fields, wells fouled with corpses, wretched captives in chains, and terrified refugees fleeing toward the stone walls of Damascus, dragging whatever meager belongings they could carry on their backs. Step closer through the dust, leaving behind the kings and commanders. Meet Thomas, a Syrian Christian olive farmer who inherited the cultivation of this red earth from ancestors who tilled it since the days of the Roman Republic. To Thomas, the glories of Constantinople were merely a legend, recounted by men clad in silk, men who visited his village only to harvest its crops and requisition its sons. For years, Thomas watched his village suffer under the yoke of imperial officials. Because he and his neighbors belonged to a local Christian sect that diverged from the emperor's official doctrine, they were branded heretics. Their priests were beaten, their icons smashed, and their harvests confiscated to fund Heraclius's distant wars. More than once, Thomas had buried a neighbor who died under the tax collector's lash rather than surrender grain his family needed to survive the winter. Now Thomas stands at the edge of his field, clutching his young daughter to a chest heavy with anguish. On the horizon, a thick column of black smoke rises toward the blue sky. The granary of the next village over, he guesses. Or perhaps the watchtower. The local Byzantine garrison had fled hours earlier, taking the village's last horses with them, and leaving nothing behind but empty promises of return. Word had reached Thomas that the invaders slaughtered anyone who drew a sword against them, hunting down stragglers and deserters without pity, yet spared those who surrendered and paid the jizya tribute, a mercy that felt, in that moment, almost obscene in its narrowness. As the thunder of hooves grows louder and the earth trembles beneath his bare feet, Thomas realizes that the Roman order, which had protected and exploited his forebears for 700 years, is vanishing like morning dew. For the desert is knocking at his door, bearing with it an entirely new order, written in fire, iron, and blood. The cavalry of the Rashidun army, clad in coarse wool cloaks against the biting cold, had sealed every one of the city's gates. 6 massive gates led into the metropolis, and 6 armies were positioned to cut off every road, intercept every supply wagon, and halt any desperate messenger attempting to slip out under the cover of darkness. Most were captured before they could even clear the tree line, their fates serving as a silent lesson passed from watchtower to watchtower. Campfires encircled the city like a second horizon, and at night the voices of the besiegers could be heard chanting across the frozen fields, close enough for the sound to carry over the walls and reach the homes of the starving. Inside, more than 100,000 souls were trapped, citizens, soldiers, and tens of thousands of terrified villagers who had fled here, believing the stone walls meant safety. The city air was thick with the scent of damp horse sweat, burning wood, and a cold, suffocating panic. Supplies were dwindling to the point of exhaustion. Grain stocks meant to last an entire season were exhausted within weeks, consumed by a multitude of desperate mouths. In the alleys near the Straight Street, families boil leather belts and saddle straps to make a broth for sustenance, carefully scraping the pot clean even after every trace of marrow has vanished. Children, too weakened by hunger to even weep, simply watch. Each morning, they climb the ramparts and gaze into the freezing mist, praying to catch sight of the shimmering banners of Emperor Heraclius's relief army advancing from the north. Yet no relief is coming. The emperor has fled to take refuge far away in Antioch, while outside the gates stands the commander Khalid ibn al-Walid, watching the walls with eyes like polished flint and a patience that rivals winter itself. It is the night of September 18th, 635. A storm rages over Damascus, lashings of rain blinding the Byzantine guards stationed atop the eastern gate, drumming so loudly against helmet and stone that a man could not hear his own voice, let alone an enemy's approach. Inside the city, the imperial garrison has let its guard down. A local nobleman has just celebrated the birth of his son, sharing wine with the exhausted officers along the battlements, laughter and toasts rising into the wet night air, even as sentries further down the wall nod against their spears, lulled by cold and drink and months of false quiet. Khalid ibn al-Walid does not sleep. Through the pitch-black deluge, he moves like a ghost along the outer moat, cloak plastered to his frame, rain sluicing off armor blackened with pitch to swallow the torchlight. He has spent the night preparing ladders crafted from heavy leather ropes and grappling hooks, tested twice over, lest a single failed throw betray them all. With a hand-picked strike team of his most brutal and battle-hardened warriors, men chosen not for rank, but for their willingness to kill in silence, Khalid swims across the swollen moat, pitch-dark water dragging at their clothes, the current threatening to pull weaker men under. They throw their hooks. Iron teeth bite into the ancient stone, and for one held breath, no one moves, waiting to see if the storm has swallowed the sound. Within minutes, Khalid scales the wall like a phantom, fingers numb, muscles burning, rain stinging his eyes. The first guards die silently, their throats cut before they can raise the alarm, their bodies eased down rather than dropped, so as not to wake the man sleeping 10 paces further along the wall walk. Then, Khalid reaches the gatehouse. He throws open the massive wooden doors, and with a roaring battle cry that shakes the foundations of the street, the main body of his army rushes into the eastern quarter, torches guttering against the rain, steel ringing against steel in the dark. What follows is an explosion of absolute violence. Khalid's swordsmen sweep down the street, cutting through startled Byzantine soldiers, stumbling half-armored from their barracks, painting the stone cobblestones red in the torrential rain, the water running pink into the gutters long before dawn. Doors are kicked in. Those who reach for a blade are cut down where they stand, while others, faster to grasp what is happening, throw down their weapons and press themselves flat against courtyard walls, hands raised, praying the distinction between combatant and civilian will be honored in the chaos. Khalid moves through the carnage like an avatar of vengeance, merciless, unyielding, his blade rising and falling with mechanical efficiency, leaving behind him a street littered with the fallen, and a garrison that had celebrated a birth only hours before, now scattered and broken. While Khalid ibn al-Walid is hacking his way through the eastern quarter, a completely different scene is unfolding on the opposite side of the city, one that will decide whether Damascus is remembered as a massacre or a treaty. At the Jabaya Gate on the western wall, the gentle and pious general Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah stands before the city's Christian leadership and local governor, men who arrived at his camp before first light, cloaked and hurried, terrified of being seen. Terrified above all of Khalid's reputation, a name already spoken in the city's churches like a curse. The city leaders realized the end had come and slipped out under cover of the storm to negotiate with the one commander known to prefer mercy to slaughter. Abu Ubaidah, a man of deep faith who prefers diplomacy to unnecessary bloodshed, grants them generous and specific terms. Surrender the city, hand over your weapons, pay a poll tax, and your lives, your properties, and your churches will remain untouched. A promise he commits to in writing, sealed before witnesses, so that no ambiguity might later be exploited. As dawn breaks, Abu Ubaidah marches peacefully into the city from the west, his soldiers walking with their weapons lowered, sheathed even, so as not to alarm the trembling residents lining the straight street to watch the men who might have killed them, instead offer only silence and open hands. And then, at the heart of Damascus, right outside the grand church of St. John the Baptist, its dome rising pale against the clearing sky, the two commanders meet face to face. Imagine the scene. From the west comes Abu Ubaidah, accompanied by smiling city elders and priests carrying cross standards, robes still dry, faces still whole with relief. From the east comes Khalid ibn al-Walid, covered from head to toe in blood, not entirely his own, his sword dripping onto the wet stones, his eyes wild with the frenzy of a battle not yet fully spent, his men behind him dragging bound prisoners and driving frightened civilians before them like livestock. The two generals glare at each other across the square, and for a moment the fate of the city balances on nothing more than which man's will bends first. Khalid demands the city be put to the sword as a conquered prize of war, his right by the old law of arms. A city taken by force owes its conqueror everything, including its blood. Abu Ubaidah steps between Khalid and the cowering citizens, holding up his hand, unarmed, unflinching. "I have granted them protection," Abu Ubaidah declares, his voice carrying clear and steady across the square. "And the word of a Muslim cannot be broken." After a tense, agonizing silence that hangs by a thread over the fate of thousands, a silence in which every soul in that square, conqueror and conquered alike, seems to hold its breath, Khalid lowers his sword. The terms hold. Damascus has fallen, split down its very center between force and treaty, between the sword's right and the word's honor. The old Roman order in Syria has been severed at the root, and the road to Jerusalem lies wide open. In August 636 AD, Emperor Heraclius mobilized his army for a final, desperate gamble. Realizing that the Levant was slipping from his grasp, province by province, he spent months marshalling the Byzantine Empire's remaining resources to assemble a massive force. It comprised over 40,000 heavily armed legionnaires, Armenian infantry, and Christian Arab cavalry from the Ghassanid tribes, all under the command of the imperial general Mahan. Stretching out behind the advancing columns were long supply trains laden with grain, spare arrows, and fresh mounts. This was no mere raid or punitive expedition, but the empire's last stand, with its entire fate hanging in the balance on a single battlefield. The Muslim commanders realized they could not withstand a crushing blow of such magnitude while scattered across various cities. Khalid ibn al-Walid made a bold and decisive move. He ordered all military garrisons throughout the Levant, in Damascus, Homs, Baalbek, and every territory won at great cost in blood over the previous 2 years, to abandon their posts and withdraw southward to consolidate into a single, unified strike force. Although some of his commanders hesitated to relinquish lands bought with such heavy sacrifice, Khalid silenced their objections with a stark reality. A fragmented army would be destroyed piecemeal, whereas a united army might survive. The two armies met on the plains north of the Yarmouk River. It was a high plateau, encircled by deep, perilous ravines that plunged hundreds of feet toward rocky riverbeds, forming a death trap whose true nature neither side grasped until it was too late. On one side stood a formidable, disciplined imperial war machine, resplendent in polished steel armor, silken banners, and golden crosses. Its ranks stretched to the horizon, with sunlight glinting off 10,000 helmets. Opposite them stood a lean, hardened army, tempered by the harshness of the desert, comprising 30,000 warriors, clad in leather, iron, and coarse wool. Though outmatched in numbers and equipment, they were veterans of 2 years of unbroken victory. The air was thick with heat and tension, ready to ignite the entire plain at the slightest spark. Even the horses in both camps stood unnaturally still, their ears pinned back as they sensed what was to come.
For 4 days, the battle raged in a relentless cycle of brutal attrition, attacks and counterattacks that ceased only with exhaustion and the onset of darkness. Nights were spent retrieving the wounded from a battlefield where crossing, even by torchlight, was a deadly gamble. Vahan's massive infantry battalions slammed against the Muslim lines like iron battering rams, repeatedly pushing them to the brink of disaster. Yet, time and again, Khalid's reserve cavalry plugged every breach on the verge of collapse at the very last possible moment. On the 4th day, the sky turned black, heralding death. Armenian archers within the Byzantine army, arrayed in disciplined formations the likes of which the Muslims had never before encountered, unleashed a dense, precise volley of arrows. These blotted out the midday sun, forming a curtain of black shafts that hissed through the air, tracing arcs over the battlefield in near total silence before raining down like a storm upon their targets. Listen to the screams of terror echoing across the valley. Hundreds of desert warriors fell. Arrows pierced their armor and mangled their faces so severely that their comrades could no longer recognize them. Cries of agony rose up as iron arrowheads tore through flesh and shattered eye sockets. Blinded, men stumbled amidst the crush of bodies, their hands groping at their ruined faces as they called out the names of brothers and cousins who could no longer answer. History would immortalize this moment as the Day of Lost Eyes. 700 men lost their sight in a matter of minutes, and the battlefield filled with a new harrowing sound that drowned out the clash of steel, the moaning of disoriented men unable to distinguish friend from foe, or even sky from earth. The Muslim lines began to waver and collapse under the weight of the unbearable slaughter. Ranks disintegrated, and men surged back toward the rear camp in a human tide that no single commander could stem. Women emerged from the rear camp, clutching tent poles and stones, and ran toward the fleeing men, screaming at them to return and fight or face eternal shame. It was even said that some struck their fleeing husbands and brothers across the face to stop them from escaping. The battle teetered on a razor's edge between survival and total annihilation. And for one agonizing, unbearable hour, no one, neither Khalid nor Vahan, nor even the gods worshipped by both armies, knew which way the scales of fate would tip. It is the sixth and final day. Fierce desert winds, the Khamsin, familiar to the desert suns yet entirely alien to the Byzantine legionnaires, are raging from the south, whipping up waves of searing, scorching sand that blind the eyes and lash directly into the faces of the Byzantine soldiers. They can barely breathe, let alone see. Their ranks, which had held firm for the past 5 days, begin to disintegrate into utter chaos amidst the din of coughing and eyes irritated by the swirling dust. This is the moment Khalid ibn al-Walid has been anticipating. Indeed, the very moment he has been paving the way for through 6 days of grueling, bloody combat and strategic patience. With surgical, martial precision and decisive ruthlessness, Khalid unleashes his elite forces, the Mobile Guard, a heavy cavalry strike force he had held in reserve throughout previous crises, refusing to commit them even when his lines teetered on the brink of collapse. They sweep around the dust-blinded Byzantine flank in a wide, devastating arc. Khalid seizes the only wooden bridge spanning the sheer rocky ravines of the Wadi al-Khattab, thereby cutting off the Imperial Army's sole escape route, and issues orders to hold the position at any cost. There will be no retreat, no regrouping, and no second battle. This is the only battle. Now, terror gives way to a horrific slaughter. Khalid's cavalry charged toward the throngs of panicked, suffocating Byzantine soldiers, driving them relentlessly toward the precipice. The men were packed so tightly that the wounded could not fall to the ground. Even the dead remained upright, propped up by the bodies of comrades pressing in from every side. Look down into that yawning chasm. As the swirling dust cleared, a nightmarish scene was revealed. Entire legions, blinded by dust and paralyzed by panic, were being forced backward over sheer rocky cliffs by the sheer weight of the men pressing from behind. No soldier chose to leap of his own volition. Each was driven by the sheer terror of the man at his back. Thousands of heavily armored men, along with panicked horses, plummeted hundreds of feet to crash against the jagged rocks at the canyon floor. Yet the fall itself was perhaps a mercy compared to the fate awaiting those who survived the descent. The sounds of snapping bones and the clatter of metal armor filled the canyon, echoing up from the depths long after the light began to fade, transforming the gorge into something resembling a gaping, bleeding wound rather than a riverbed. By nightfall, 40,000 imperial soldiers lay dead, captured, or shattered at the bottom of the abyss. The Byzantine field army, the last force the empire could muster, intended to decide the war, had vanished. It was not merely defeated, but utterly obliterated. As Emperor Heraclius fled Antioch, seeking safety in Constantinople, he cast a final glance at the mountains of the Levant, the province his ancestors had ruled for 7 centuries, and said wistfully, "Farewell, a long farewell, O Syria." The backbone of the Roman Empire in the Levant was broken forever, and nothing remained to stand between Khalid ibn al-Walid and the ultimate prize, Jerusalem. In late 636 AD, rising above the rolling hills of Judea, stands Aelia Capitolina, Jerusalem. For centuries, this city has been the golden heart of the Christian world, its skyline crowned by the majestic golden domes of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Church of the Ascension, its streets worn smooth by the feet of pilgrims who have trodden them for 700 years. Yet today, the city groans under a paralyzing dread. Even the church bells toll with a tone lacking their former certainty. From atop the citadel of David, Patriarch Sophronius, Jerusalem's spiritual leader, an elder who has spent his life defending the city's faith with a ferocity rivaling that of any soldier guarding its walls, gazes out over the Judean countryside. News of the Battle of Yarmouk has settled over the land like a funeral shroud. Imperial legions annihilated, Heraclius in flight, and no hope remaining for a relief army. Meanwhile, refugees from coastal cities stream through the gates, bearing blood-curdling tales. Stories of cities that resisted, and others that surrendered, and of the divergent fates that befell them. On the horizon, the banners of the Caliphate appear. Advancing with deliberate patience, they creep forward, not like a passing storm, but like an inexorable tide. Muslim legions, led by Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah, encircled the city and blocked the roads to Jericho and Jaffa, severing the last lifelines connecting Jerusalem to the outside world. There were no siege engines battering the walls, nor flaming arrows raining down upon the rooftops. Instead, there was a mercy that stirred an anxiety among the defenders far greater than any direct assault could provoke. The city could muster its strength to confront fire and steel, yet it was powerless to withstand the silence and the passage of time. Abu Ubaidah's intent was not to destroy Jerusalem, but to subdue it through the weapon of hunger, a strategy clearly understood by all who stood upon the ramparts, without a single word needing to be spoken. As the winter months dragged on, and provisions within the city dwindled to nothingness, Sophronius watched his flock weep and plead. He witnessed the emaciation of children and the frailty of the elderly, realizing with each passing week that faith alone could not fill the empty granaries. The ancient Roman order was breathing its last, while the holy city stood utterly alone. Early 637 CE. Inside the dim, vaulted chambers of the Holy Sepulchre, Sophronius gathers his desperate bishops and city elders around a table where, not so long ago, matters of doctrine and liturgy were debated. Now, it holds only the grim mathematics of survival. The city's granaries are empty. The urban poor are eating boiled weeds and the bark stripped from ornamental trees, and disease is beginning to whisper through the crowded alleys, the way it always does when hunger opens the door for it. Outside the gates, Abu Ubaidah sends a messenger offering terms of surrender, terms notably without threat attached, an offer extended rather than a demand shouted. Sophronius knows that to resist further means inviting the bloody wrath of Khalid ibn al-Walid, whose terrifying cavalry sits camped just beyond the olive groves, his reputation from Damascus and Yarmouk having long since outrun any messenger who might have carried it. The city needs no report to know what that name means. Sophronius makes a grave, momentous decision. One he turns over for days before speaking it aloud to his council, some of whom weep openly at the thought, and others of whom weep with relief that it may yet be spoken at all. He will surrender the holy city, but he will not surrender it to a mere general. Return to your camp, Sophronius instructs the Muslim emissary, his voice trembling with age and burden but steady in its resolve. Tell your commanders that the keys to Aelia will be handed over to no officer, no general, and no warrior. I will surrender this sacred earth only to your supreme ruler, the commander of the faithful, in person. Abu Ubaidah accepts the condition without argument, recognizing in it not defiance, but a dying empire's last claim to dignity. A fast rider is dispatched across hundreds of miles of scorching desert, changing horses at every outpost, carrying a message to the distant city of Medina. The holy city waits for its new master. In the spring of 637 AD, a lone man arrives atop a dust-covered camel, accompanied by only a small retinue. There is no honor guard, no fanfare, and nothing to distinguish him from any other traveler on the road to Medina, save for the men walking silently beside him. It is Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second Caliph of Islam and ruler of an empire stretching from Yemen to the frontiers of Asia. He arrives as if bearing a routine message, not as one coming to receive the keys to one of the holiest cities on earth. Reflect deeply on this moment, for history rarely witnesses such a stark contrast. Atop the Mount of Olives stands Patriarch Sophronius, draped in heavy robes of shimmering silk woven with gold thread, and surrounded by weeping priests bearing jewel-encrusted crosses, while incense rises from swinging censers. A scene embodying the full majesty and ceremony accumulated by Christian Rome over 7 centuries, with the assembly lining the mountainside as if awaiting an emperor. Approaching him, in contrast, is Caliph Umar, holding the reins of his camel himself, having brought no servant to do so on his behalf. He wears neither crown, nor silk, nor iron armor. Instead, he is clad in a coarse woolen garment, patched in several places by his own hands. The soles of his shoes are worn from the arduous journey from Medina, and the dust of the road still clings to his beard. Sophronius is struck with awe, tears welling in his eyes as he whispers in Greek to his bishops, initially unable to reconcile the scene of humility before him with the terror this man's name had inspired in every province he had traversed. Truly, this is the abomination of desolation prophesied by the prophet Daniel. His words were not so much a condemnation as an expression of the bewilderment of a man witnessing the established order of his entire world reshaping itself in a single moment. Yet Umar moves not with the arrogance of a conqueror, but with dignity and serenity. His eyes gaze upon the ancient city lying below, with a sentiment closer to reverence than to the euphoria of victory. The two men step toward one another, the desert prince and the shepherd of an ancient faith, two elders meeting on a mountainside. It was a scene that, by the laws of war known to both, should have compelled one to kneel before the other, yet neither did so. Umar sits beside Sophronius with patience and composure, drafting the historic pact known as the Covenant of Umar, guaranteeing the Christian population safety for their lives, property, and holy churches in exchange for the payment of the jizya, tribute. The terms of this covenant were recorded, not as an act of grace or mercy from a victorious conqueror, but as a formal, binding obligation. They were read aloud twice to ensure that no witness could later claim any ambiguity regarding their meaning. Sophronius guides Umar through the city, showing him the splendor of Christian Jerusalem with the careful pride of a man showing a stranger into his family's house for the first time. Uncertain what will be taken, hopeful that something will be spared. They stand together beneath the towering rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, staring up at the grand dome that marks the tomb of Christ, sunlight falling through the oculus in a single golden column between them. Suddenly, the hour for the Muslim afternoon prayer arrives, marked by nothing more than the quiet shifting of the men accompanying Umar, glancing toward the sun's position out of old habit. Sophronius turns to Umar, extending his hands in a gesture that costs him more than either man will ever say aloud. "Pray here, commander of the faithful, pray inside our holy church." Umar pauses on the threshold, 1 foot already inside the shadow of the great doorway. He looks at the beautiful marble floor, then at the tearful eyes of the Christian clergy standing around him, and in that pause seems to weigh not just this moment, but every moment that might follow it. Generations he will never meet, arguments he will never be present to settle. Gently, Umar steps backward, out of the grand portal, and onto the stone pavement outside the church. He kneels alone on the bare street, bowing his head toward Mecca, indifferent to the cold stone or the eyes watching him from every window and rooftop nearby. When his prayer is finished, Umar stands and turns to Sophronius, and there is something almost apologetic in his tone, as though explaining a kindness rather than announcing a decision. "Had I prayed inside your church," Umar explained softly, "the Muslims who come after me would surely have taken it from you, saying, 'Here Umar prayed,' and turned your holy shrine into a mosque." With that single act of restraint, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is saved for Christendom, a small stone marker later placed on the spot to remember it by. The keys of Jerusalem have changed hands, not through a bloody slaughter, but through a covenant etched in stone and honored remarkably for generations to come. The Byzantine chapter of the city has closed forever, and the Islamic era of Bayt al-Maqdis has begun. Shortly after the surrender of the city in 637 CE, Caliph Umar asks Patriarch Sophronius to guide him to the site where the ancient Temple of Solomon once stood, a request that visibly unsettles his Byzantine host, who leads him there with evident reluctance, as though hoping the Caliph might change his mind along the way. For over 5 centuries, since the Roman legions of Titus destroyed the Second Temple in 70 CE, the Byzantines had intentionally left the massive stone platform abandoned. To demonstrate the fulfillment of Christian prophecy regarding the Old Covenant, the authorities turned the holiest site of Jewish history into the city's municipal dump, a deliberate and calculated humiliation, renewed with every cartload tipped onto the stones for generation after generation. Look upon Umar as he steps onto the platform, sandals sinking into decades of accumulated filth. He does not see an empty wasteland. He sees the sacred ground associated with the prophets of old and the site of Prophet Muhammad's night journey, Isra and Miraj. Horrified by the piles of rotting offal and garbage covering the stone, mounds so deep in places that the original paving is nowhere visible, the Caliph drops to his knees without a word of instruction to anyone around him. Umar pulls up the hem of his rough wool tunic and begins scooping filth into his own skirt with his bare hands, working in silence while his stunned attendants stand frozen for one long moment, uncertain whether to intervene or follow. His generals and soldiers rush forward to join him. Senior commanders who led cavalry charges at Yarmouk, now on their knees in refuse beside their caliph, hauling debris in cloaks, tunics, whatever will hold a load. Side by side, conquerors and locals clear tons of debris from the stone bedrock, the work stretching across days, blistered hands and aching backs, until at last the foundation stone beneath is exposed to open sky for the first time in half a millennium. Pale, weathered limestone catching the light like something remembering itself. On the southern edge of this cleared platform, Umar orders the construction of a simple wooden house of prayer, a raw, modest structure of timber and rope-bound beams, deliberately unadorned, capable of holding 3,000 worshippers. The physical resurrection of the site has begun, built first with hands before it is ever built with stone. For over 500 years, Roman and Byzantine edicts enforced a brutal law. Under pain of death, no Jew was permitted to reside within the walls of Jerusalem. Once a year, on the fast of Tisha B'Av, Jews were allowed to buy access to the ruins to weep over their fallen sanctuary. A single sanctioned day of grief, purchased at a price, watched over the entire time by soldiers counting the hours, only to be driven out again by imperial guards before nightfall, herded back through the gates like trespassers in their own ancestral city. Now, watch as Umar exercises his authority as the city's new sovereign. He repeals the centuries-old imperial ban with a single decree, undoing 500 years of exclusion in the time it takes a scribe to draft the order. Umar invites 70 Jewish families from Tiberias and southern Palestine to resettle permanently within the city. Watch them march through the northern gates, families carrying small chests of heirloom books wrapped in cloth against the dust, old men weeping openly as their feet touch the stone-paved streets of their ancestors for the first time in living memory, children too young to understand the weight of the moment tugging at their parents' sleeves, asking why everyone is crying if this is supposed to be a homecoming. They are granted a dedicated quarter in the northeastern part of the city, near the Mount of Olives, close enough to the Temple Mount that from certain rooftops the cleared platform is visible at last. Under the new legal order, non-Muslims become dhimmis, protected subjects. They are barred from bearing arms and must pay the jizya poll tax, but they are granted internal religious autonomy, the right to property, and the freedom to worship according to their own law and custom. The monolithic single-faith Christian fortress of Byzantine Aelia vanishes within a single generation, replaced by a multi-layered pluralistic city where Jewish, Christian, and Islamic life begin to intertwine in the same markets, the same streets, the same uneasy but enduring coexistence. 5 decades have passed since Umar's death. The center of gravity of the Islamic world has shifted from the desert oases of Medina to the grand civilized metropolis of Damascus, now the capital of the Umayyad Caliphate, a court of silk, administration, and imperial ambition that would have been unrecognizable to the desert commanders who first rode into Syria 60 years earlier. It is the year 691 CE. Caliph Abd al-Malik ibn Marwan sits on the throne in Damascus, ruling an empire that stretches from the borders of India to the shores of the Atlantic, a domain vaster than Rome at its height. To immortalize the triumph of Islam and visually rival the magnificent golden dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre across the valley, a deliberate architectural answer, built to be seen from every rooftop and hillside that could once see only the Christian skyline, Abd al-Malik commissions a masterpiece of engineering, sparing no expense of gold leaf, imported stone, or master craftsmen drawn from across the empire. Look upon the skyline of Jerusalem now. Rising directly over the sacred foundation stone on the Temple Mount is the Dome of the Rock, a building unlike anything the region has seen before or since. With its octagonal Byzantine geometry, vibrant blue tiles imported and fitted by hand, gilded wooden dome catching the sun from every angle of the valley below, and sweeping Arabic calligraphy proclaiming the oneness of God spiraling around its inner walls, the building alters the skyline forever, a permanent architectural statement etched into the city's silhouette. Years later, Abd al-Malik's son, Caliph al-Walid, replaces Umar's original wooden mosque on the southern edge with the stone magnificent structure of the Al-Aqsa Mosque, completing what began as bare hands clearing refuse decades before. Jerusalem, now known as Beit al-Maqdis, the Holy House, is visually, spiritually, and permanently anchored as the third holiest sanctuary in Islam, its skyline forever after telling the story of everything that led to this moment. Step back and look upon the expanse of the Near East in the decades following the conquests. In a single generation, the ancient world was swept away. The Sasanian Empire of Persia was completely erased, a dynasty that had ruled for 4 centuries reduced to memory and ruin within a few short years of catastrophic defeat. The Byzantine Empire was permanently severed from its richest provinces, Syria, Palestine, and Egypt, reduced to a rump state clinging to Anatolia and Greece, a shadow of the empire that had once called the Mediterranean its own lake. Yet, this transformation was not a sudden apocalypse of blood and ash, however violent its individual chapters had been. The cities of the Levant, Damascus, Emesa, Jerusalem, were not burned to the ground. Their Christian and Jewish populations adapted to a new reality, gradually adopting the Arabic language, administrative customs, and philosophy, while maintaining their sacred traditions under the umbrella of caliphate rule. Churches and synagogues standing for centuries more within sight of new minarets rising beside them. The conquest of Jerusalem in 637 CE did not destroy the city. It reshaped it into a living, complex tapestry where 3 Abrahamic faiths would claim every inch of stone, every handful of dirt, and every horizon, sometimes in uneasy tension and sometimes in unlikely harmony, but never again in the singular exclusivity any one of them had once enforced. The seeds planted by Khalid's sword, Umar's covenant, and Abd al-Malik's golden dome would define the spiritual and geopolitical fault lines of the Near East, not just for centuries, but for the rest of human history, their echoes audible in this same valley to this very day.